Good morning, guys. We're basically wrapping up with our last chapter from your textbook on the structure of the Federal Reserve System and monetary policy. This is kind of a continuation on from where we started the unit with money and the history of banking. We took a little detour with personal finance, but now we're back to figure out how the nation's central banking system actually works and how that affects the money, the bank accounts, and everything that we touch as consumers. You may have been hearing a lot of news articles on what the Fed is doing in response to the crisis right now. So you're going to see some things that you've been hearing about, but I hope I can explain in more detail for you, okay? Today's notes are there for you. If you want to download them and follow along, you can, but this is the basic gist of everything you need to know in order to be successful on that test. All right, so right off the bat, I wanted to show you guys these pictures at the bottom because some of these buildings are going to look familiar to you. The bottom left is the Board of Governors office in Washington, D.C., and it is where monetary policy is made for the nation. It is kind of like the capital city, so that's, of course, where the capital of the Federal Reserve System is. And whenever somebody reports from the Fed, that's the thing that's usually behind them, and people automatically assume they're about to hear an update on the economy from the Federal Reserve. What you see on the right are two views of the same building, one from the air where you see the dollar sign in the middle of the courtyard there, marking the Dallas Fed. If you're ever flying into Dallas to Love Field, when you fly over downtown Dallas, if you are able to sit on the window, you'll look over and see this building. And it's one of the original 12 banks that was basically designed back in 1913. So, of course, this is a new facility today. So if you're ever over at Clyde Warren Park, you'll look over and you'll see the structure. It's basically a faceless, and that's kind of the way they like to keep it, because once all the cash is printed over at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, it goes into the vaults at the Fed and it gets distributed to member banks who do business with this region. So it's kind of cool that we have a local presence that strong. We have only the second Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which prints more than half of the nation's currency. And then right across town and right across the Metroplex in Dallas, we have the Bankers Bank, where it all goes into the vault and then out to the rest of the nation. So in 1913, when Dallas got this bank as part of the first system that was established, it kind of changed the nature of that city to a banking city. Prior to that time, you probably would have confused it with Fort Worth as another kind of cow town. So this really did transform the future of Dallas and made it more a center for commerce. So way to go, Dallas. Big Texas exceptionalism there. But all right, so here's the thing. In understanding the nation's central bank, you remember from our history video that there were some challenges with the first banks of the United States. There was this big clamor for too much power. They're against the little guys, so they became quick enemies of people who were for things like states' rights. The new system that's put into place balances those powers out and basically divorces itself from politics so that decisions can be made about the economy based on what the economy needs, not what politics tells it does. So it's kind of a misnomer when you call the nation's central bank the Fed. People tend to think it's a branch of the federal government, but I hope by the end of this slide, you're going to realize, no, that's not the case. It's actually owned by member banks, who I want you to think of as like shareholders in the system. They buy into the system and they get the backup support of a much larger entity in case of a crisis or in case of emergency. But it's their decision making that basically runs the show. These guys are like shareholders in any major corporation. So there really is no connection to the federal government between the federal government and the Federal Reserve. It's owned by its independent member banks who have a share in the system and its benefits. So this is an independent central bank. It's run by the Board of Governors, for whom you saw the office there in the previous slide. There are 12 members of the board. They run for periods of 14 years, and they're appointed by the president, but then make independent decisions after that. No two Board of Governor members are able to, actually two at a time, come up for approval by the president and then confirmation by the Senate. So there's not going to be a president who's able to stack this in his or or her favor because their presidential term will run out before the next appointments come up. So if there's a connection, that probably is the one. But you saw in the previous videos, there are 12 Federal Reserve districts that were set up based on the population during the time in 1913. That's probably why several of them are heavily weighted toward the east and not the west. But new banks have been added that are regional, and it's kind of distinctive. Texas has the one in Dallas, but it also has three of the regional banks, one in El Paso, one in Houston, and one in San Antonio. So it tells you how big the Texas economy is if they're making those decisions based on where the action is, right? Some states don't even have a Fed presence, like my home state of Mississippi. They have to do business and split up the state a little bit. So it's interesting. FOMC, this is the Federal Open Market Committee, and this is where monetary policy really is decided. Do we raise interest rates? Do we lower interest rates? Do we buy or sell more bonds? By we, I mean the Fed, and they get to basically impact the value of cash in your wallet. So very, very powerful committee. We'll talk about that later. The advisory arm of the Fed is the Federal Advisory Council, and they basically hear from the local banks and the regional banks before national policy and decision is made. So you're going to see a graphic here in just a second, so you can see all the working parts of the Fed. Think of the FOMC as the strong arm of the Fed, while the FAC is just there for holding everything in place and balancing it out, okay? You have the FOMC chair, who basically sits at the helm and runs this thing like a CEO of a major corporation. For a long time, it was Alan Greenspan, actually through my high school years. And it was an unusual Fed chair situation where he actually served for Republicans and for Democrats. Ben Bernanke is the guy you'll probably recognize your parents talking a lot about during the Great Recession. His PhD in college was all about what to see or learn from the Great Depression. So when he saw familiar signs, he knew pretty much exactly what to do. His successor was the first female chair of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, and basically ran policy in the same vein that Ben Bernanke did, having been one of the assistant Fed chairs there. And then Trump's appointee recently, Jerome Powell, took that chair over in 2018 and has been to the day running an independent Fed, despite what the president would like for him to do or not to do. So that makes me feel confident that this is a strong agency that's basically going to, run economic policy independent of the Fed. So let's move on to the images here. If you look from upper left and make a clockwise circle, you can see the faces of the people who you're going to see in cartoons later. The Fed chair often gets lampooned for saying this or that because they have so much moral suasion and power. Up in the upper left, that's Alan Greenspan with the glasses there. The guy that's balding there on the right, or bald, is Ben Bernanke. His successor down below is the female with the white hair, Janet Yellen. Be careful. A lot of you guys on cartoons assume that you're looking at Hillary Clinton, and that would completely change the context of what we're talking about for those banking cartoons. So just realize most of your cartoons in this chapter are going to be about the Fed, not about general politics. The guy on the left here then is the new person, Jerome Powell. And whenever you hear his name, you better pay attention. When he makes an announcement on the part of the Fed, you usually see an immediate correction of Wall Street. So these guys have, real effective power. Just their words and what they say can affect the decisions you and I make after that. So here's the graph that I promised you that kind of shows the structure of the Fed. My challenge is for you to find where the federal government is. Well, if you look carefully, it's nowhere. It's not connected to this process, and that's a good thing for the health of our American economy. If someone were to come into power who had an ideological approach to economics and wanted to force the economy to do something on a political grounds, you and I could suffer as a result. So it's important to note that after appointment and approval by the Senate for the Board of Governors and the Fed chair, then this thing runs basically like a major corporation. If you look down at the bottom, you guys can see with my cursor here, these are the member banks that you and I do business at. They're all over South Lake in Texas. They might be registered with the state of Texas or with the national government, but these are like our banks where we have our savings and checkings accounts. They are represented by the local Dallas Fed that you can see right there, is one of the original 12. Dallas was in the running with a much larger city at the time, New Orleans. So it was kind of a little mini coup that Dallas beat out that much larger commercial center at the time. And we were kind of seen as a gateway to the West at the time, even though Kansas City also holds that moniker. They thought basically growth would happen here. And when that occurred, they basically became a self-fulfilling option. So a self-fulfilling prophecy. So these are the 12 district banks that are represented. You can see their members sit on the Federal Advisory Council. The presidents of those banks actually provide input to Washington, D.C., so they're traveling back and forth all the time. You know, if a recession hits a country, it likely impacts it different ways. During the Great Recession, California, New York, those coastal cities really were hurt by the real estate boom. But here in Texas, things were a little different. It was much more stable. So it's good that the Board of Governors actually listens to what the Federal Advisory Council says, because they need input from all the market centers before they change their minds about policy. The strong arm of the Fed is on the other side. You see the advisory arm, the strong arm, the FOMC. 7 members of the board and 5 presidents of the regional banks come in and make decisions about the monetary policy tools that affect the value of the dollar. So the Fed open market chair sits here. Currently, it's Jerome Powell. In the past, it's been several other people. But now you can kind of see how this works like a major corporation, right? Shareholders, middle management. This is kind of the board that sits at the top. And the CEO kind of runs the FOMC over on the right side. Okay, so just to review, you got to remember there's a trick question on this test coming up that says, who owns the Fed? And 50% of you will be tempted to say the government, because that's our answer for everything, right? If we want to blame something that's going wrong on somebody, it's got to be the government. That's not the case here. As a matter of fact, you guys need to make a note that this thing does not even use taxpayer money. It gets its money from its member banks. Sometimes the Fed becomes an unpopular target politically and people want to defund it. Well, go right ahead. It gets 0 taxpayer dollars. In the past year, it donated $52 million back to the federal economy or federal budget. So I don't think we want to get rid of the Fed anytime soon. That would be like shooting ourselves in the foot, so to speak. So what you're seeing on the right there updates everything that we've said. These are abbreviations you'll see again for your vocab quiz as well as the test. Know the FAC, know the FOMC as important parts of the Fed. Okay. All right. So here's a map. I thought we should look at how this played out in 1913 when the Federal Reserve System was established. You have the star there, which represents the capital, and they're all spread around. You see the district banks. Now, if any of you are Hunger Games fans, this is an interesting map. Dallas is region 11. So I think that's interesting. If you look around, there's no region 13, at least currently, with the Federal Reserve System. And of course, I'm being facetious. But the idea is I think somebody was looking at this map when they came up with the Hunger Games trilogy, thinking that this is eventually what the U.S. would look like. We know that making projections on population in the future is a little risky, and that's exactly what happens to the Federal Reserve System. What you're not seeing on the map are 25 more additional banks. And like I said before, Texas gets 3 more there. So we're pretty solidly a part of the economic system of the U.S. All right. So guys, I have here 3 different topics we need to talk about, 3 different tiers of responsibility that the Federal Reserve is designed to take care of. Its top tier responsibility today is to manage our nation's money supply. And because you guys know that the money supply is not backed up by gold or silver, it's got to be managed very, very carefully, because the value of the stuff in our pocket is determined in part by how much of it is in circulation. So the money market management the Fed does is its most important priority today, and we're going to focus on that in more detail next time. We'll be talking about things like the reserve requirement, where banks are required to keep a certain portion of their reserves on hand at all times. The Fed gets to decide how much. We'll talk about how interest rates are affected by the discount rate, which is an interest rate that bankers pay. Believe me, when they pay more, we're going to pay more. So these things are supposedly locked together. We'll talk about that. Open market operations, well, that's just a fancy way of talking about open market transactions or the buying and selling of government bonds. The Fed is in charge of how many are on the market, and we'll talk about what effect that has on the money supply and how monetary policy is really, really important. Now, I have to say, this was not the original function of the Fed. The Fed was just going to be like a backup system to support banks in the midst of a crisis. But over time, monetary policy has risen to the fore, and it's become the most important thing the Fed does for us today. If I had to show you what the bank was all about in 1913, it would be this. It would be basically its role as a members bank, a banker's bank. Whenever there was a crisis, an earthquake or a fire or something that basically tanked the economic sector in one part of the country, there was a local Federal Reserve Bank, district level, that basically could support and provide those banking services for people who were in need. Excuse me. So they provide loans not to you and I, but to banks that basically dip into their legal reserves. Occasionally that happens, and it's kind of hard to gauge how many loans are made in a day until you get to the end of the day. And if you find you're in trouble, you can go to the Fed for a short-term loan, keep that bank solvent and active. Check clearing used to be a super huge problem. If people wrote checks on the West Coast, from a bank that they had an account in on the East Coast, that check in 1913 had to go overland or around through the Panama Canal. I mean, basically, that was not an easy thing. And then it had to make the return trip in order to clear that account. So the Fed has had a hand in processing that more quickly in a local sense, and that they are literally not too far away from where those checks are being written. Today, the Fed has had the job of electronifying the process or digitizing the process. So even when people write a check, it's basically going to become a digital transaction right at the point of purchase. And they've been heavily into that process of changing the way that you and I do business. Currency distribution, you guys don't have to take your old dollar bills in and change them out for new ones. The Fed takes care of that automatically. When an old bill basically goes through the system, it's read, and if it can't be read, then it's pulled immediately for the system, and the Fed replaces it. Sometimes the Fed orders more money to be put back into the monetary system based on what its monetary goals are. But you and I don't have that job of taking care of it, so our dollars don't expire. In other countries, you might have money that's demonetized, but that doesn't happen here. Of course, in the fourth quarter, if there's a lot of shopping going on and banks are holding way too much money, they can use the bank like a safe house, right, where they keep excess deposits. So this really is the role that the Fed was designed for, being a banker's bank, but that has changed over time. Of course, we talked about this initially as being the United States Bank, right? The bank for the federal government. It runs that function today, but it's not like the Bank of the United States. It is part private, part public in the way that it operates. So there's a very clear system of checks and balances when it comes to that economic power. But as the bank for the federal government, if the government needs to write a check, like the checks that have been written lately, the Treasury Department issues the order, and then the physical issuing of the checks goes through the Federal Reserve System, either directly into your account digitally or through a printed check. The purchase and sale of government securities, guys, we've talked about that. If you or I were interested in Treasury bills or buying some savings bonds, the amount and price of each one would be determined by how many were out there in the first place, and that's basically decided by the Fed. Bank regulation and bank examination, man, this is something that's been talked about a lot since the Great Recession. The Fed had the job of going in to banks that were risky or doing things in a bad way and closing them down in the days following the Great Recession. I went to a training at the Fed during that time, and they said they would quietly go in on Friday afternoon, settle everything up over the weekend, and then Monday morning people would find out that the bank had definitely closed and that their funds were elsewhere, or that they were backed up using FDIC funds. But today we have the Dodd-Frank Act, which is supposed to address that too big to fail situation we found ourselves in 2008. But they've been heavily engaged in making sure that our banking system is solvent. They run stress tests. They do all kinds of spot checks. They're really trying to make sure that our banking system doesn't pull another 2008. Foreign currency exchange, if you're traveling abroad, you're going to need either euros or pounds or some form of currency once you land. You'll probably turn to your bank to get that order, but then your bank is going to turn right to the Fed to fulfill that order. So it's basically providing all of those banking needs. So we've reviewed the three tiers of functions that the structure of the Fed is designed to do. For next class, we'll be talking about interest rates and how they affect your bottom pocket. For your vocab quiz and vocab crosswords and all of that stuff, I wanted you to know what the prime rate was. Now, this is the very best interest rate that any person on the market could get. The person with spotless credit history, who doesn't bounce a check, who pays everything on time, they should be accessing the lowest rate out there, and that is what's known as the prime rate. You got to realize that interest is how much you have to pay in order to borrow someone else's money. And that rate will go up the worse your credit history is. So you definitely want to be making sure that you're qualifying for the prime rate. That rate is in part determined by the rates that bankers pay. The federal funds rate would be paid in a situation where basically you had a member bank getting into trouble, going to another member bank, a buddy bank in the system. They exchange funds. When it's time to pay the loan back, they pay the federal funds rate. The discount rate is where you go downtown to the Dallas Federal Reserve as a bank that's in trouble, and you beg and plead for a short-term temporary loan. When it's time to pay that back, you'll pay the discount rate. Those two asterisks you see there, basically those are the things that are determined by the Fed. And when those rates rise, the prime rate will rise. And if you know anything about what's going on right now, interest rates are the lowest they've been. The Fed is trying to generate spending. When prime rates and interest rates vary by even 1%, you see people change their minds about buying a house or buying a car. So this is very much tied to the expense of paying for loans, and that's going to be something that we talk about in more detail next time. All right, so with that being said, then you should have enough information to begin your crossword and your guided reading activity. Next class, we'll come in and talk more about what the Fed does today with its monetary policy and why that's so important for you to know. Thanks, guys. We'll see you later.